Margaret Hale had lived 60 years with a quiet dignity, the sort of presence that filled a room without the need for grand words or heavy gestures. She was never the loudest voice at the table, never the kind of woman who demanded recognition or applause. She believed in simple things, a warm cup of tea shared with a neighbor, a well-tended garden where roses bloomed each spring, and evenings filled with the hum of old jazz records that carried her back to the youth she had once lived so fiercely. But life, she discovered, had a cruel way of changing its tune when age began to creep into one's skin. It began slowly in whispers, in shadows that seemed to gather when she entered a room. Her children, 2 sons and a daughter, once so eager to hear her stories, now exchanged looks when she repeated herself or hesitated to recall a name. They lowered their voices as if her hearing had become fragile too, as if silence could protect her from the truth of their judgments. Yet Margaret's ears were sharp, perhaps sharper than they had ever been, because she had learned to listen not just to words, but to the pauses, the sighs, the faint irritation buried beneath their tones. One evening, as she sat in her armchair, knitting a scarf that had grown uneven with her distracted fingers, she heard them in the hallway. She wasn't meant to. They thought she had dozed off. Her eldest son, Richard, spoke first, his voice hushed but firm, the way one speaks of a problem they don't quite know how to solve. "She's losing it," he said. "I swear she asked me 3 times today what day it was. 3 times. There was a pause, and then her daughter, Anna, sighed. I noticed it too. She left the kettle boiling on the stove last week. I had to run and turn it off before the whole kitchen filled with smoke. It's dangerous." Their younger brother, Peter, added with a nervous chuckle, "She called me by Dad's name yesterday. It's unsettling." The 3 of them grew quiet, as if even they felt guilty for the conclusions forming in their minds. Then Richard said the words that pierced Margaret's heart like a blade. "She's not the same. I think she's slipping into, senility." Senile. The word burned in her ears. She sat motionless, her knitting needles frozen mid-air, her breath caught in her chest. For a moment, she wondered if perhaps they were right. Had she become forgetful? Yes, sometimes. Did her hands tremble? Yes, on occasion. But her mind was alive, buzzing with memory, brimming with sharpness. She remembered things they didn't. She remembered the day each of them had been born, the weight of Richard in her arms as snow fell quietly outside the hospital window, Anna's first cry on a humid August night, Peter's wide eyes staring up at her under the harsh fluorescent lights. She remembered the sacrifices she made, the nights she stayed awake to stitch clothes, the mornings she skipped meals to pay for their education. She remembered every unkind word their father had spoken, every tear she had shed in silence, every triumph she had won alone when no one else believed in her. If this was senility, then the word had no meaning. What she felt was not confusion, but clarity, the kind that comes with years of watching, learning, enduring. The kind of clarity that her children, still busy chasing their own lives, could not yet imagine. But Margaret did not cry, not then. She sat still, her face calm, her knitting resumed, though her fingers trembled. Not from weakness, but from the effort of holding her fury inside. She had never thought her children would betray her in this way. Not with malice, perhaps, but with carelessness. They believed themselves to be protectors, rescuers even, yet she could feel the shadow of greed just beneath their concern. She knew how people spoke in town, the way neighbors looked at her house with its wide porch and its sturdy oak doors. The Hale home was valuable. To her children, it might seem like nothing more than a property, an asset to be claimed when she was no longer in control. As the whispers continued, Margaret leaned back, letting her eyes drift shut so that if they peeked in, they would think she was asleep. In truth, her mind was running faster than it had in years. They thought her mind was crumbling. In reality, she had never been sharper. She was listening, she was learning, and most importantly, she was waiting. Over the next few weeks, Margaret began to notice more. Richard insisted on driving her to the market, though she knew perfectly well how to handle the wheel. "It's safer," he said, as if she were a fragile vase that might shatter on the road. Anna started organizing her medications into tidy little boxes, labeling them with dates and times, just to help. She said though Margaret had managed her prescriptions without fail for years, Peter began appearing unannounced, opening her fridge, checking her cupboards as if expecting to find evidence of her decline hidden between the milk and the bread. The indignity of it all weighed on her, but she endured, because Margaret understood something they did not power often hides in patience. To strike too soon would only prove them right, but to wait, to watch, to gather every careless word and every sly glance, that was how she would one day turn the story around. Still at night, when the house grew quiet, and the only sound was the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, she felt the sting of their betrayal. She thought of her late husband, who had died years ago, leaving her to raise the children mostly alone. He had not been a kind man, but he had at least respected her strength. The irony of it all, living long enough to see her own children doubt her mind, was almost too cruel. Sometimes she sat by the window and watched the world outside, where children ran with laughter, where young couples argued and made up, where the seasons rolled forward without mercy. She wondered if this was how it always ended for women like her. Women who had given everything, who had built families from the ground up, only to be told in the end that they were no longer useful, no longer capable, no longer trusted with their own lives. The thought hurt, but it also hardened her resolve. Because if they wanted her to be senile, she would give them senile. She would let them believe it. She would let them lower their guard. And when the time was right, she would show them just how dangerous it was to underestimate a woman who had spent her life surviving. So when Anna corrected her for the third time about the date, Margaret smiled sweetly and said, "Oh dear, I must be getting forgetful." When Richard asked her if she remembered the way to the doctor's office, she pretended to frown in thought before replying, "I think I might need your help." When Peter laughed about her calling him by his father's name, she shook her head and chuckled softly, letting them think it was the slip of a tired old mind. But behind her eyes, behind the careful mask of forgetfulness, Margaret's thoughts were sharp, her memory flawless. She remembered every word they spoke, every sigh of exasperation, every false smile of concern. She wrote it all down in her journal each night, her handwriting steady, her entries meticulous. No detail escaped her. And in that journal, one phrase appeared again and again, a reminder to herself in the quiet of the night, "They think I am fading, but I am only waiting." Margaret knew then that her story was not yet over. She was 60, yes. Her hair had silvered, her skin bore the lines of years well lived, but her mind, her greatest weapon, remained unbroken. They would learn that soon enough. For now, she played the role they had cast her in, the forgetful mother, and I was the fragile woman, the senile old lady who couldn't be trusted to boil a kettle. But in the shadows of her thoughts, she was preparing, sharpening her resolve like a blade hidden in velvet. And as she closed her eyes that night, listening once more to the whispers outside her door, she smiled to herself. Let them whisper. Let them plot. When the time came, she would outsmart them all. Margaret had always been a woman who understood the value of silence. She knew that silence could be soft as a feather or sharp as a blade. It could hide weakness, but it could also disguise power. When she realized her children believed she was losing her mind, she made a choice that would define the months that followed. She would not correct them. She would not fight their words head on. Instead, she would wear their lie like a mask, letting them see exactly what they wanted to see, while behind the mask her eyes remained wide open, her mind sharper than ever. The first time she pretended to forget something deliberately, it almost made her laugh. Richard had asked her what day it was, his tone heavy, with the kind of patience one might use with a child learning numbers for the first time. Margaret could see the subtle smirk that followed when she hesitated. She looked at him, tilted her head, and whispered, "Is it Thursday? No, maybe Wednesday." She let her voice trail into uncertainty. Richard patted her hand as though she were a pet. "It's Friday, Mother. Don't worry." He left the room looking satisfied, certain his suspicion had been confirmed. When the door shut behind him, Margaret's lips curled into the faintest smile. She whispered the date under her breath. Friday, the 12th, her voice strong and sure. She had written it in her journal that morning. They thought she was fading, but the truth was that she had never been more alive. Soon she turned this act into an art form. She let her hands shake when pouring tea, though her grip was firm when no one was watching. She stumbled over names, sometimes calling Anna by her own grandmother's name, then covering her mouth with a frail laugh. She allowed them to feed their narrative, to see what they wanted to see. For the first time in years, her children spent more time around her, but their visits weren't born of love. They were laced with suspicion, with calculation. Margaret saw it clearly. Anna began showing up with folders of paperwork. "Mother, I know it's confusing, but maybe we should talk about setting things in order. You know, just in case." The words, "just in case," hung in the air like poison. Margaret nodded slowly, feigning confusion. "Yes, dear, whatever you think is best. I trust you." But when Anna left the room, Margaret opened the papers, studied each line carefully, and then wrote detailed notes in her journal. Anna, meeting with solicitor, attempted to mention property, tried to persuade me gently. I agreed outwardly, did not sign. Peter's approach was clumsier. He was too young, too impulsive to play the long game. One afternoon, he casually said, "Mom, that house is too big for you now. Imagine how much easier life would be if you sold it and moved somewhere smaller. We could even help manage the money for you. You wouldn't have to worry." His grin was too eager, his eyes too bright. Margaret blinked, tilted her head, and asked softly, "Oh, do I really have a house?" "I sometimes forget, isn't it just home?" Peter laughed nervously, assuming she was confused, and let it go. But later that night, she wrote in her journal, "Peter, direct, mentioned selling house, greedy undertone, does not see I am watching." Richard, on the other hand, was patient, careful. He acted as though everything he did was for her safety. "Mother, you shouldn't drive anymore. What if you forget where you're going?" He offered to handle her bank errands. He suggested consolidating her accounts for simplicity. He spoke to her doctor without her knowledge, asking if there was a way to test her memory. Margaret played along. "Yes, son, maybe you're right," she said, nodding with a fragile smile. Inside, however, she felt her rage simmer like boiling water under a lid. She understood what was happening now with painful clarity. They were circling her life, carving pieces of her independence as though they were carving meat from a bone. They did not want her safety. They wanted her silence, her submission, her assets. And if she resisted, they would use the word against her, senile. That word was their weapon. But she was learning to sharpen her own. Each evening, when the house grew still, Margaret opened her leather-bound notebook. She documented everything. Dates, times, words spoken, expressions noticed, documents presented. She even began recording small details, where Richard's gaze lingered, how Anna's tone shifted when money was mentioned, how Peter's knee bounced nervously whenever he lied. The notebook became her lifeline, her shield. If they thought her mind was broken, this book was proof that it was not only intact, but methodical, strategic. She also began preparing in other ways. She quietly transferred small amounts of her savings into a new account at a different bank, one her children knew nothing about. Each visit to the bank was done under the guise of confusion. "Oh, I thought I needed to check my balance," she told the teller, her eyes wide with feigned forgetfulness. But she was precise with her instructions, sharp with numbers. The teller, a young woman who had grown fond of Margaret's gentle manners, never questioned her. At home, she began reorganizing her will. She did not tell her children, of course. Instead, she contacted an old friend, a lawyer she trusted from years ago, and arranged secret meetings. In those meetings, she was not the fragile, trembling woman her children believed her to be. She was steady, articulate, fierce. She explained her plan carefully, ensuring every detail was airtight. She wanted to protect her home, her freedom, and the legacy she intended to leave behind. Not to greedy hands, but to causes she believed in. The more her children pressed, the stronger her resolve became. Anna tried to convince her to attend memory classes at a nearby clinic. Margaret went once, played the part of the confused old woman who couldn't remember a simple list of words. She failed deliberately, earning sympathetic pats on the hand from the instructor. Later, alone at home, she recited the entire list backward, every word intact. She wrote them in her journal, laughing to herself at the absurdity of it all, but pretending took its toll. Some nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her chest tight with sorrow. These were her children. She had carried them inside her, had kissed their scraped knees, had stayed awake with fevers and nightmares. She had loved them fiercely, selflessly, and now they watched her like hunters waiting for their prey to stumble. The pain of that betrayal was almost unbearable. Tears would slip down her cheeks in the dark, but by morning she wiped them away and replaced them with the soft smile of the role she had chosen to play. She reminded herself of one truth: this was not just about revenge. It was about dignity, about reclaiming the right to live her final decades on her own terms. She would not be caged in some sterile care home, her freedom stripped away because of lies. If her children thought her powerless, they would learn how dangerous it was to underestimate her. So the performance continued. Margaret let her daughter spoon sugar into her tea, as if she were too weak to do it herself. She let Richard insist on filling out her forms, only to forget where she had put the pen. She let Peter chuckle at her supposed confusion, while secretly recording every greedy suggestion in her notebook. Day after day, she wore the mask of forgetfulness, each act sharpening the blade she was quietly forging in secret. Her journal grew thicker, her bank account safer, her will rewritten, and with each passing week, she felt her strength returning, not the strength of youth, but the deeper strength of experience, patience, and unyielding resolve. By the time her children believed they had her cornered, Margaret was already prepared. They thought she was stumbling toward the end. In truth, she was setting the stage for a reckoning none of them would forget. The day began like any other, though Margaret could feel in her bones that it would not end that way. There was a heaviness in the air, a stillness that settled in her chest as she folded her shawl over her shoulders and sat quietly in her armchair. Her children had been circling her life like hawks for months, and she sensed they were ready to swoop. She had seen the signs, Anna's increasing urgency, Richard's cold patience, Peter's nervous eagerness. They believed the time had come to strip her of the little autonomy she had left. What they didn't know was that she had been preparing for this exact moment, sharpening her mind and her plans like a blade hidden in the folds of cloth. It was mid-morning when they arrived together this time, which in itself was unusual. Richard always preferred to come alone, controlling, measured, sure of his role as the eldest. Anna usually slipped in during the afternoons, disguised in sweetness, pretending her visits were simply born of love. Peter was scattered, unpredictable, drifting in and out with excuses and forced laughter. But today, they came as a unit, a front, which told Margaret everything she needed to know. She heard the crunch of gravel under their shoes before the knock came on the door. She rose slowly, deliberately, as though her joints resisted her, and shuffled to open it. Richard stood at the front, papers in hand, his expression that of a man carrying a heavy but necessary burden. Anna followed close behind, her lips curved into a soft, practiced smile. Peter lingered, his eyes darting nervously, as though even he knew what they were doing was wrong. "Mother?" Richard said with a tone too calm, too careful, "We've come to talk. It's important." Margaret nodded, stepping aside, her voice carrying the frailty she had perfected. "Of course, children. Come in. Sit down." She led them into the sitting room, where the old clock ticked steadily and the air carried the faint scent of lavender polish. She settled into her chair while they arranged themselves around her, like judges preparing to deliver a verdict. Richard laid the papers on the coffee table, spreading them with a precise hand. "Mother, we've been thinking about your safety. You know how forgetful you've been lately, and we're worried. We don't want anything to happen to you." Anna leaned forward, her eyes glistening with false concern. "We'll love you, Mother. We just want to make sure you're cared for properly. It's too much for you to live here alone." Peter added, his voice shaky, "And the house, it's big. It's hard to maintain. You don't need the stress. We've found a lovely care home. Safe, warm, with people around you all the time. You'll never be lonely." Margaret's hands rested in her lap, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. Not from weakness, but from the sheer control it took to remain composed. She glanced at the papers, seeing the words she had anticipated: power of attorney, guardianship, consent. Documents that would strip her of her independence, her voice, her rights. They wanted her signature, her surrender. For a moment, silence filled the room. The clock ticked louder, the air seemed thicker, and Margaret let the pause stretch until even her children grew uneasy. Then she reached forward, her hand hovering over the pen that Richard had placed beside the papers. Her fingers brushed it, her body shaking just enough to sell the illusion of frailty. She let them believe she was about to give in, about to scrawl her name and hand them everything they desired. And then she stopped. Slowly, deliberately, Margaret lifted her gaze. The mask of confusion fell away, the trembling ceased, and her eyes sharpened like steel. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady, strong, and laced with fury. "Do you think I'm a fool?" The words sliced through the air, leaving her children stunned. Richard blinked, Anna's smile faltered. Peter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time in months, they saw not the fragile old woman they had imagined, but the mother they had always underestimated. Margaret reached beside her chair and pulled out the leather-bound notebook. She placed it on the table with a firm hand, the sound echoing like a gavel striking wood. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, her voice low but powerful. She opened it, flipping through pages filled with neat, steady handwriting. "Every word you've spoken to me, every attempt to manipulate me, every suggestion to sell my home, to take my money, to lock me away. I've recorded it all." Richard's face paled. Anna reached out as if to stop her, but Margaret snapped the book shut with a force that silenced the room. "Not only that," she continued, "but I've already spoken to a lawyer. I've protected my accounts, rewritten my will, and secured my estate. Everything you think you're about to take has already been placed beyond your reach." The silence was suffocating. Peter's eyes darted to Richard, searching for guidance while Anna's lips parted in protest. But Margaret wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice cutting sharper with each word. "You call me senile, but I remember more than you ever will. I remember the nights I went without so you could eat. I remember the sacrifices I made so you could have an education, a future. I remember carrying you through storms, through sickness, through grief. And this is how you repay me, by circling me like vultures, by plotting behind my back, by reducing me to a fragile mind you think you can control. Anna stammered, "Mother, it's not like that. Don't lie to me." Margaret's voice thundered, filling the room with a power her children had never heard before. "I've listened to your whispers. I've seen the greed in your eyes. You wanted me weak so you could take what is mine. But I am not weak. I am not broken. I am not senile. And I will not be buried alive while I'm still breathing." Her words hung in the air like smoke after a fire, choking the silence that followed. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His composure, his careful mask, had cracked. Peter looked at the floor, shame burning his cheeks. Anna's eyes welled with tears, though whether they were born of guilt or frustration, Margaret did not care. She stood then, slowly but firmly, her back straight, her shoulders squared. "You will leave my home," she said. "You will not speak of selling it again. You will not attempt to steal my freedom with your papers and your lies. If you care for me, you will respect me. If you do not, then know this. I am prepared to fight you with everything I have, and you will lose." Her children remained frozen, as though struck dumb by the force of her words. Margaret took the pen from the table, not to sign their papers, but to point it at them like a weapon. "I built this life with my own hands. I raised you with every ounce of strength I had. I will not let you take the rest of it from me." The room was thick with tension, the clock still ticking, the smell of lavender suddenly cloying. Slowly, Richard gathered the papers, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding hers. Anna wiped her cheeks, murmuring something that sounded like, "Who only wanted to help." Peter muttered an apology too quiet to be sincere. Margaret watched them leave, one by one, the sound of the door closing behind them echoing through the empty house. She stood still for a long time, her chest heaving with the storm of emotions she had kept hidden for months. Then, slowly, she sank back into her chair, the leather notebook resting on her lap. For the first time in months, she felt peace. Not the peace of resignation, but the peace of victory. She had faced them, unmasked them, and reclaimed her power. They could whisper all they wanted, spread their lies, call her senile. But the truth was hers, and she had proven it. That night, Margaret slept more soundly than she had in years. The walls of her home felt warm again, protective hers. She had fought back and won, and in doing so, she had reminded herself of the strength she had always carried. In the quiet darkness, as she drifted into sleep, one final thought lingered in her mind. They would not bury her before her time. She would live on her terms, sharp, unbroken, and victorious. And when the end did come, it would not be with the shame of surrender, but with the pride of a woman who had outsmarted them all,